Right, so this video is going to introduce what I consider to be the top 5 strengths of the INTP default cognition. Now, I actually consider this type to be a little bit underrated. Obviously not in terms of popularity, nor the amount of people mistyping into it, nor the way in which their introverted thinking tends to be placed on a kind of intellectual pedestal. No, rather in regards to the unhealthy stereotypes that are often attributed to people of this type, and subsequently the way in which the rest of the type's cognition tends to be heavily downplayed. And what stereotypes, you say? Well, you could talk about the kind of cold robot stereotype who's fairly stuck in the head, entirely fixated upon logic and largely socially inept. You could talk about the absent-minded professor stereotype, a person who's so perpetually preoccupied with their own internal musings that they lack any real ability to kind of practically navigate the real world. Or you can talk about like the more nerdy kind of stereotypes, the person who's just stuck indoors all day playing video games, reading books, and never really getting any sunlight. And while of course these stereotypes can be applied and are applied to many different cognitive types, it tends to be the INTP who receives the unfair brunt of it. Generally speaking, people might look to the natural abstract intellectual abilities of this type and discount the rest of what makes them human. And as with all CPT videos, I'm not going to be using the MBTI dichotomies, the whole INTP thing, because they are not particularly useful and they don't really align with a person's cognitive functions anyway. Hence why so many people mistype into INTP. These dichotomies are just general kind of personality traits which are fluid and can change across a person's lifetime. So let's dive into the video, starting with the strength people will be most familiar with in regards to this type: precise logical analysis. And the emphasis really is upon precision here. The introverted sensing lens to which introverted thinking is assigned within this type lends this type a high fidelity of internal experience as pertains to objective internal frameworking. This type doesn't just see a general kind of sense impression of logical criteria, but actually zoom down into the fine details of any given logical problem they are entertaining. And this is what differentiates the type from the ISTP. Both of these types have introverted thinking in dominant position, but the internal lens to which this function is assigned actually changes the way in which the type interacts with this particular codec. And in many ways, TiSi is the chisel this type uses to chip away slowly at whatever they happen to be sculpting internally. However, this type's preference for intense internal scrutiny and general kind of tinkering upon any given problem they are working with does not mean this type is inefficient or stuck in the details. You see, introverted sensing in this type operates upon a continuum with introverted intuition, and this introverted intuition is very much the sub-authority of this type, therefore having a highly compulsive drive. And it is actually, as I'll be getting into later in the video, the relative unconsciousness of this lens function that allows this type to generate multiple different ideas without trying to force together a single cohesive internal narrative. What a lot of people attribute to extroverted intuition is actually the unconscious introverted intuition feeding this type novel, but oftentimes unrelated ideas. But back to the logical internal scrutiny. The broad internal lens of introverted intuition acts as a kind of vista with which this type can use to survey the general landscape of their logical internal frameworks. And using this bird's eye view of introverted intuition, this type can easily kind of spot any areas that might need work, or any areas that might be more interesting within a mind than other ones. So imagine a person who primarily works in terms of internal scrutiny but can happily zoom out to achieve a big picture overview before once again zooming down into the details. And this is what makes the introverted thinking of this type so naturally dynamic. They were capable of achieving both internal scrutiny and holistic overview. It is simply that their ego resides more within the former than the latter, and as such this type is more likely to be employing prolonged periods of precise internal critique than they are rushing from one general idea to another one. And in many ways this type is a natural executive of introverted frameworking, because they're not just working in concepts, but they're actually going into the very brick and mortar of any given internal logical structure. This type is actually extraordinarily capable of passing anything that they externally perceive with extroverted intuition through a very precise internal filter system. And this actually makes them very gifted logical filters of humanity. They can take in information, pass it through extremely precise and intense logical scrutiny, before disseminating it to everybody else. And this is actually a great incentive for this type to activate their dominant axis. With a more convergent use of extroverted feeling, this type can much more effectively relay all that they've scrutinized to other people. And their ability to spot and amend contradictions that other people may have simply not noticed, makes them incredibly, incredibly valuable to the human race. Within the INTP's frameworks, no stone is left unturned. Now, strength number 2 is what I will refer to, for the purpose of this video as possibility bouncing. And by possibility bouncing, I mean this type's, in my opinion, extraordinary capability to very naturally entertain multiple different, oftentimes contradicting possibilities inside the head at the same time. Being a big NI convergent, my ego generally has a hard time doing that kind of thing. My NI kind of forces and blends all of these different ideas into a single cohesive narrative. Whereas with an INTP, you have a type who can very naturally kind of entertain all of these different ideas alongside each other. You see, introverted sensing, introverted thinking allows this type to essentially compartmentalize different ideas. When people say idea bouncing, they might think of extroverted intuition, but it's very important to bear in mind that this function operates on an axis with introverted sensing. It is the combination of introverted sensing and extroverted intuition, which allows for different multiple ideas to be so compartmentalized, rendered separate by the discreteness of a precise internal lens. When I say possibility, I'm not talking about something always grounded in the external concrete, but anything that comprises the generation of new ideas, because every single idea is a possibility, it's a potential. And the INTP is extremely gifted at balancing and entertaining multiple different potentials together at the same time. And it is the combination of this type's introverted intuitive sub-authority, firing as it does novel insights into the introverted thinking, introverted sensing realm, and the type's extroverted intuitive authority function, which instills an egoistic need to maintain an open mind, that instills within this type a natural creativity and lateral thinking style. And the creativity of this type tends to be heavily downplayed in favor of the intellectual stereotype often assigned to them. But in reality, they are often both. Yes, they like to really hunker down into precise internal analyses and can be indeed very bookish. But they are also often writers, artists, musicians. You can generally bet in the course of their lifetime an INTP to have dipped into many a different creative field. And their disparate kind of curiosity and exploratory attitude allows for natural innovation to occur within these areas. You might have an INTP who's primarily an artist and who does software engineering in his spare time, or you might have an INTP who's a full-time software engineer and just uses art and creativity to unwind. But generally speaking, this type very happily balances the technical with the creative. And in an ideal world, they find a way to synthesize both together. And again, owing to the TiFe axis, because again, these two functions operate alongside each other rather than separately, considered alongside the highly precise introverted thinking of this type, there is here a natural kind of linguistic aptitude. And as such, out of all of the creative fields, it is often script writing and comedy that this type most naturally gravitates towards, because this allows the INTP to blend their precise use of language with their natural creative inclinations. And of course, this is just one of the many ways in which this type can achieve a kind of symbiosis between their preferred cognitive faculties. And all of this also allows this type to come up with fail-safe options and contingency plans if things don't work out in the way that they might want them to. And this type may even spend more time accounting for all of the different possibilities of external reality than they do upon focusing upon a single desired outcome. And this makes this type extraordinarily adaptable. And for as long as they can use their divergent functions more convergently, that is to say, more actively interact with the external world through extroverted feeling and extroverted intuition, this type can be very naturally opportunistic, not only able to spot opportunities but also seize them. And as such, it is when this type achieves a level of balance between their introverted and extroverted functions that they can navigate most fluidly and indeed happily all that life entails. So the third strength of the INTP pertains to the predictive capacity that tends to stem from their extroverted intuitive authority function, with this particular external lens function being much more divergent in nature. The emphasis is much more upon cautious observation of external contingencies. And you can probably see how this sets the type up for natural attunement to consequences. It is important to note that consequences within this type are processed within a more intuitive thinking-centric modality than an FI-centric one, and therefore tend to pertain to a more detached understanding of what is logical and what is not, and may not necessarily be as invested in, protecting and safeguarding the individual's own mental health, or even in some occasions their relationships. But with extroverted intuition here being assigned to an extroverted feeling codec, they are highly, highly aware of social contingencies within the moment for as long as they are still abiding by their extroverted feeling function. That is to say, for as long as they aren't around those people who they do drop their extroverted feeling with, or maybe just interacting on a more online, FE detached environment, they tend to be very, very naturally attuned to the social flow. But as I'm going to be getting into in the next point, they simply place more emphasis upon observing extroverted feeling flow than acting upon it. But with external contingency being assessed more on a TI-centric basis, this does make for a person highly adept within the realm of risk assessment. And as much as this type can have unfair stereotypes attributed to it insofar as, being relatively chaotic and go with the flow in many ways, when an INTP pursues something, they tend to have a backup plan, because the extroverted intuitive authority function tends to make the type highly aware of all the things that could go wrong. And I would not in any way, shape or form consider the INTP to be a reckless type. Quite the converse. And this factored in alongside the natural critical ability of this type makes for someone who can in many ways illuminate areas of risk and consequences that other types may simply not notice. But going into strength number 4 of this type, while this type can drop extroverted feeling to some extent around people they are close with, the actual pairing of extroverted intuition here is more adjacent to extroverted feeling than it is to extroverted thinking. So whereas say an INFP may be more aware of how the general logical flow is going on in the external world without needing to go into a TI-centric modality in order to assess the kind of more logical implications, the INTP is so naturally aware of the extroverted feeling flow around them that they don't need to go into an FI-centric modality in order to assess the implications. And it is the realm of extroverted feeling which is the most underrated strength of this type. People tend to attribute to the INTP, after all, an inferior extroverted feeling. And this is not strictly inaccurate when it comes to convergent employment of this function. Hugs and cuddles and kisses, all that kind of stuff. But insofar as actually being aware of what's going on within the external, holistic, emotional landscape, this type can be incredibly well attuned to laws and customs, differing subcultures and social circles. And as somewhat of a dichotomy within INTP insofar as they can be quite offensive to people with whom they trust and therefore let go of their extroverted feeling with. But on the flip side, oftentimes with people they do not know and they have not established that rapport with, they are oftentimes the most inoffensive out of all of the types. Abiding by external social atmospheres in a harmonious way is actually a talent for this type, because a hyperdivergent extroverted feeling is a hypercautious extroverted feeling. And until an INTP has established a rapport with someone, or maybe they're just, trolling on the internet, they tend to be a very naturally socially cautious and polite individual. And on the back of this hyperdivergent extroverted feeling, as they develop more social confidence and, say, self-esteem, they can develop a more fluid, dominant axis that allows them to engage extroverted feeling more convergently. Network, promote themselves, establish necessary connections in order to advance themselves in any given career ladder that they choose. And I've actually known many INTPs in real life, in fact, who have excellent networking capabilities. The divergent extroverted feeling alongside the dominant introverted thinking allows this type to naturally kind of gauge the mood of another person. And oftentimes a natural extroverted intuitive curiosity of this type generates multiple different questions to ask the other person to make them feel appreciated and to keep the flow of conversation going. The entrepreneurial side of INTPs is often overlooked, whereas it is the honed FENE networking skills of this type that affords them the opportunities that they can seize upon and integrate with extroverted intuition in the first place. And the fifth and final strength of this type, well, within this video at least, because obviously there were more than 5 strengths of an INTP, pertains to the systemization that they can acquire through prolonged engagement with their dominant pairing. There's one massively overlooked strength of the INTP, in which their introverted thinking, introverted sensing, highly refined and precise internal frameworks can essentially extend into the extroverted thinking, extroverted sensing atmosphere in order to create effective procedures and systems. While all human beings can do this, TI dominants tend to be particularly gifted at refining and honing, crafting internal skill sets with which they can then, through procedural memory and the like, extend into extroverted thinking in order to effectively execute these skill sets in external reality. And once an INTP begins this process and to fully activate their extension gateway into TiSi, they can become extraordinarily efficient at anything they pursue. And the natural convergent attitude of this dominant pairing makes for an individual who is constantly perfecting and refining their systems and skill sets over time. And it is through this TiSi extension gateway that the INTP effectively defies their stereotype of being in any way unconscientious, because through this pathway, this type can actually become rather procedural. And these procedures are not just related to, computers and technology and gadgets. It can actually apply to their entire daily structure. As much as this type does like to go with the flow, as much as this type does like room to use their more momentum-based NE productivity, the procedural quality of TiSi activated TiSi allows this type a much more harmonious relationship with their extroverted intuitive authority function. More of a balance between their need to explore and create and go with the flow, and the natural translation of their carefully crafted internal frameworks and skill sets and knowledge banks into external reality. And more procedural INTPs can even crave a level of structure in their lives, because the external world becoming structured is simply a byproduct of their own internal formulations. So that concludes the video. I hope it's been informative, and if you know anyone who you think might benefit from the content of this video, be sure to share it with them as well. I did make it a little bit shorter this week, just trying out different formats and seeing what works best for you. If, regardless of what type you might be, you're interested in further developing your cognitive type and activating all of the various different gateways and pathways of your cognitive map, I do provide type coaching. And if you're uncertain about what your type might be, I also recommend checking out the CPT type service as well. If you're interested in exploring more of the fundamentals of CPT, I do recommend checking out the book. And if you would like to support the channel and the theory on that additional level, I also have a Patreon page as well. So that's it from me, and I'll be back in a couple of weeks. For now, take care.